Well, it's my privilege this morning to introduce the speaker today. You may know him probably. He's been here with his family for over 3 years. Noah Kingham and Jolene, they've served in this church. They've been faithful saints here, and we're thankful for them. But our goal at Calvary is to raise up leaders, to train leaders, and to equip leaders, men to preach. And it's exciting to see when guys want to preach and they have a ministry mindset. Noah has a ministry mindset, and he wants to minister to military and law enforcement. And so he's pursuing that path of ministry. So this morning, Noah is going to share with us what God has for us.
Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Ooh, that was a little live, sorry. I'm Noah Kingham. I've been asked to preach today, and although Pastor Reed has asked me to preach a handful of other times, I feel today I'm a little bit better prepared to speak on God's Word. Not because it's easy or because the nature of the series we're going through. For in this season, we're going through the characters of Christmas. And we're building the story a few characters at a time. If you're new here, don't feel like you've missed out. The last two sermons are on our website, and they're also on our YouTube channel. Feel free to go back and watch them. But let's recap what's happened so far. Just like on a television show where you come in for that special two-parter in the middle and they say, last time on Magnum PI, or our story so far. So far for us, the story was, as Steve said, 2 weeks ago, Pastor Reed preached on Simeon, and how after Jesus was born and was brought to the temple, Simeon knew him instantly. And in each of our sermons, we get this bonus character. And for Simeon, we got the bonus character of Anna the prophetess, and how when she met Jesus at the temple, she went out and told everyone she could about what had just happened. And then last week, Reed preached on the shepherds and how these lowly nobodies, were able to be at the birth of Christ. And the bonus character with the shepherds were the angels, and how they came down and rejoiced and sent the shepherds to the manger. So now that we're caught up, I said that I was better prepared this time, not because I'm getting more comfortable up here, as you can tell, but that this is what I went to college for. See, I didn't go into the Army or go into law enforcement because I had some passion there, but I did it to pay my bills. No, my dream job was to watch movies for a living and write about them. I wanted to be a critic and get paid to watch movies or read books and write about them in a newspaper. Now, so I went to the University of Northern Colorado, and I got a degree in criticism. And in so doing, I learned a lot about how to look at the pieces of a story and pick it apart. I had my plans, but God had his plans. You see, I wasn't a Christian when I went to college. I was an outcast, a rebel, an outsider. And God showed me something, and it made me step out in faith and seek him. And in seeking him, I found a wonderful grace, and I fell down and worshiped him, and God lives within me now. I am more comfortable preaching today about the wise men, the magi, the three kings, because the theme of their story speaks to me. Their story echoes mine. And when we learn things about ourselves as we dig into the stories and dig into characters. That's what Reed has been doing the past 2 weeks, and that's what I'm going to be doing today with the Magi, Wise Men, Three Kings. Now, there's a lot of things involved in these characters from the East, And I'm going to be touching on a lot of some other aspects of the story. Don't worry, Reed. I won't be stealing your thunder for next week. But let's start here. I called them Magi, Wise Men, Three Kings. They have a few names they go by. But who are these guys, and why do they have multiple names? Let's look at Matthew 2:1, where it says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem." So our text calls them wise men. Now, this is an English translation from the Greek word magos. Matthew wrote in Greek, and he used the same word that was used to describe the wise men that Moses interacted with in front of Pharaoh. Remember them throwing down their staves and them turning into snakes, and then Moses throws down his staff and it turns into a snake, and his snake eats their snakes, and then it turns back into a staff? Well, that's the same descriptor of those people that Matthew is using for these three men from the east. This is also where we get the word magi, as in magic. They were called magi or wise men not because they were particularly wise or they were imbued with some sort of magic, but because they were learned men and most likely studied the stars and signs. We see this reinforced in verse 2, where it says, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." So they studied the stars. Now, they weren't astronomers like in our modern era, modern day people that study the stars. No, they're more like astrologers. They looked for signs in the stars to predict the future and to see what happened in the past. Now, although there is a case to be said for our astronomers now studying the stars for the origin of the universe and the Big Bang and how that's like astrologers, but that's for another time. We see here that they saw his star referring to the new king of the Jews and came looking for him. Now, how many people must have seen that star? How many people must have seen that star and did nothing? They just went about their night, went back to bed. No, these guys saw the star and they acted. They set forth on a journey to find out what it meant. The amount of faith that shows is extraordinary. Now, the last name that is used for them is the Three Kings. We don't really know how many there were. There's some speculation on to how many, but mostly through tradition, we say there are three because the amount of gifts they bring. How many is really not important to the story. And we know this because the Bible is big on numbers. Matthew is big on numbers, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But in the passage, we don't get how many. Now, if it was important to our heavenly author and our earthly author, Matthew, we would have had a number included here. It would have said 42 wise men came. But no, we didn't get that. So, okay, that's not important. So what is? What is important is that they stepped out and they followed the signs before them and went in search of Jesus. This is a theme that the authors are building. That in faith they set out in search of him. Let's build on this and see where our heavenly author and Matthew include them. So, why are they in this story? Why are they in the story at all? Well, let's look at what we know about them from the text. We see that they are foreigners that came from the east in verse 2. This more than likely meant they came from Persia or the Orient, as in what the song said. So we know that they're not Jewish. But we also didn't get a specific country that they were from. Matthew could have said these 3 dudes from Persia, but he didn't say that. He left it general and just showed that they were outsiders. Now, why is it important that they are outsiders to the nativity story? Why did our heavenly author and our earthly author include these outsiders? So, this was important to Matthew because he was an outsider himself. He was a tax collector. Remember when I said numbers were important to Matthew? He was a tax collector. His entire job was about numbers of people and money owed. And tax collectors in this time period were looked down upon by the other Jews because they worked for and with the Romans, taking and collecting taxes from the Jewish people and giving it to the Romans, to Caesar. Now, this is important to our heavenly author as well because God didn't come just for his chosen people, just for the perfect. No, he came for outsiders. He comes for the broken and the sinners. We are all outsiders in God's eye. We all fall short of perfection. And God has reached out his hand to all of us. So Matthew and our heavenly author are setting up a reoccurring theme that Jesus didn't just come for the Jews, God's favored people, but he came for everyone by focusing on the first non-Jewish people to worship him. Let me say that again. They worshiped him. They were worshipers. So Matthew says in verse 2 that they came from the east to worship him, and we're seeing these men as respectful worshipers because the first thing they do is they go to the king and ask him where the new king is at. Because the assumption is that it's probably Herod's son, that the current king sitting there has had a prince, right? That's what I would have assumed, that a prince was born to the current king. Well, he was, but people at the time had forgotten who the real king of the Jews was. So all these aspects of their character point us to a theme that Matthew and our heavenly author are building. These wise men, foreigners, who are outsiders, who came to worship, went in faith in search of him. Now, we generally know who they are and why they're in the story. Now, let's take a look at how they fit into the story. To do this, let's talk about the setting a bit. Setting is the place where the story happens. It gives us context to the characters. The environment of the characters are in affects how they act. Setting comes in 3 parts, so let's first look at time. Now, time affects the setting as a story because if you have someone lost in a city and they go to a gas station to get a map, or they pull out their phone and use GPS, it kind of tells you what time period you're looking at. So, the time period of the nativity story is the beginning of Jesus' life, but we need to address when the wise men show up. Now, not all biblical scholars agree on when the wise men show up to worship, but we do know that Matthew uses a different word to describe Jesus than he uses for the newborn baby Jesus. We also know, in my mind, that would suggest that Jesus is still a small child before he gets taken to Egypt. Now, we also know that Herod sets a general age limit at the end of this story of less than 2 years old. So the nativities, like we have over here, that show the wise men at the birth, they probably weren't there. But I can't say for sure. Next, we have location. We have 2 locations in this part of the story, Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Jerusalem was the capital and the religious center and was roughly about 60,000 people at the time of Jesus' birth. Again, tax collectors and censuses. We know how many people were there. Now, that's about the same population as the city of Lodi right now. Now, Bethlehem was likely to have about 300 people at the time. And that's more closely to Acampo, just north of here. Now, this shows a stark contrast between the two cities. This matters because one is the religious and cultural center of the region, and the other is most likely a crossroads. That's why that's the reason why the wise men go to Jerusalem first. You don't try and find the President of the United States at a truck stop on the highway. You go to Washington, D.C. So we see then they're directed to go to this crossroads in verse 8. He says, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him. Now, I've touched on the cultural context here, the cultural setting a little bit, but we need to extrapolate and a little bit by stating that these outsiders have come into the capital looking for a new king and been directed to the crossroads. Now, this is important because Jesus didn't come to us as a prince or a warrior. No, he came to us as a poor child in a poor family. He came to us as a servant leader. He came to us to lead us from among us, not above us. To show us the way, not just to tell us what to do. In that theme that we're building, we see that God reaching out to those outsiders who are searching for him in faith by coming down to being among them. So now we generally know who they are, why they're in the story, and where they're at in the story. Now the question is, what did they do? They came from a far-off land to worship the new king. They went to where they thought they would find the king, and this is where we meet our bonus character for today, King Herod. So King Herod is the villain of the story. King Herod was a king over the Holy Land in the times. He was most likely a Jew and a Roman. Now, every story has a villain, and by understanding the villain, it helps us understand the hero. So in looking at Herod, we see he has the same choices as the wise men, but in every choice, he chooses the opposite of them. The wise men read the stars, but Herod, a Jew, didn't even know the prophecies. Instead, he asks his chief priests and scribes to read it for him. In verse 4, he says, so he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. He hasn't studied the prophecies, and he doesn't even make an effort to try. He has the priests and scribes do it. And then the wise men follow the priests and scribes to where they should go, but Herod doesn't go himself. No, he meets in secret and tells the wise men what he wants them to return to him and let him know if they find the new king in verses 7 and 8, where it says, then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him. The wise men came all this way to find the new king, and Herod lives right there and won't even travel a few miles to go see him. No less worship him. He says he's going to worship him, but we know that's not really his plan. Because if that was really his plan, then why did he meet in secret? The wise men go back outside and they follow the heavenly sign, the star that has risen again, and directs them to Bethlehem in verse 9. After hearing the king, they went on their way, and there it was, the star that they had seen at its rising, and it led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. Now, following the star and arriving where Jesus was at, they were overcome with emotion. And in verse 10, it says they saw the star and they were overwhelmed with joy. And then finally, in his presence in verse 11 and 12, they worship him in three ways. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. They worshiped him by falling on their knees and showing reverence to him. They worshiped him by giving to him. But most importantly, they worshiped him by following his instructions. God warned them in their dreams not to go back, but to go another way. And they followed God's instructions. Now, they've been following God's instructions the whole time. From the first time they read the stars and decided to go pack up their stuff and go and worship him, to the end where they returned to their homeland by a different road. Herod doesn't worship him. He doesn't bow to him. No, Herod reacts differently. He decides to kill every boy under the age of 2 in that area. Now, in a crossroads that size, there probably wasn't more than 10 or 12 boys under the age of 2. But God had to get his son out of there because Jesus had things to do. Now, how does a poor family with nothing but a donkey in a marriage that's looked down upon by the community that they're in get money to get out of Dodge? Well, God provides. God had wise men show up with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, all very lavish gifts, all fit for a king. But it also provided them the capital they needed for Joseph and Mary to get to Egypt and set up a life there to raise Jesus. Remember when I said that Matthew was a tax collector? Population and money are important things to him. So when he tells his account of Jesus' birth, he writes down how they got the money and why they left. Matthew and our heavenly author of the story have laid out the theme of God reaching out to those outsiders who were searching for him in faith by coming down and to be with them in stark contrast to the kings of this world who do everything wrong. So what? Now, I've talked a lot about the facts of the story and how these characters fit into the story. But you may be sitting there and wondering, how does this affect me? Cool story, bro, but that was then and this is now. Well, church, we should be worshiping him how the wise men did. We should be showing up to worship. We should show up to worship with him with all of our hearts, all of our minds, and all of our souls. We should sing songs of praise, and we should pray for each other. And we should worship through serving. We should give. We should give what we can and without reservation. Give of our time, giving through our excess, but give joyfully. Now, Reed and Stephen didn't ask me to say this, and I don't get anything from your giving. This is what God is telling you to do. And we should be following his instructions. Church, when I preached on this last time, I said we need to be reading the Bible and praying to him and listening to his instructions. That's what the wise men did. If the wise men could see his instructions in the stars, we can look for ways that he is speaking to us right now. As Romans 1:20 says, for his invisible attributes, that is his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. We should be looking for those opportunities to spread the good news. And for those who are new here, And for those of you, remember that theme that Matthew had been setting up? God reaching out to the outsiders who are searching for him in faith by coming to be with him, in contrast to the kings of the world that do everything wrong. That's this story. That's Jesus' story from beginning to end. God is reaching out to you in this imperfect world. How will you respond? He has promised that if you turn to him in repentance and faith, he will be with you. Now, maybe you're sitting here, and this is your first time here, or first time in a church at all. And I've been up here, and I've been talking about the wise men and how they found their God, and maybe you're looking for your path to God. Maybe you're thinking, what is this guy? No. Well, I didn't grow up in a church. I didn't get walked to it through Sunday morning Bible classes. I had a long path to God through my rebellion. And God put people in my path to bring me here today. My own signs direct me. My own signs to direct me. When I was in the Army, I had a good friend who took an interest in my salvation. And when I had told him that I had read the first book of the Bible, Genesis, 4 or 5 times, but I couldn't get past that. Because in my mind, I had to read it from cover to cover. He suggested that I read one of the Gospels. And I asked him, which ones are the Gospels? Because I didn't know. He said, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I said, well, I'll read Matthew. That's the first one. And Matthew, an outsider, wrote in a way that spoke to me. So if you're sitting here and you have not read the gospel, maybe Matthew is for you. And if you have any questions about what is said in the Bible, or what I've preached about here, or how you can get closer to God, Pastor Reed, Pastor Stephen, and I are here to answer your questions. And if you feel more comfortable talking to one of the ladies, Miss Heather, Miss Gina, Ione, and others are here to talk to you as well. Because we all feel like outsiders until someone invites us in. And I'm here to tell you that Jesus is inviting you in. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father,